Hi, I'm Stephanie Hughes of the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center. Today I'm going to review with you the OMB data collection form that's required for all ACL dementia grantees. In today's presentation, we're going to cover several learning objectives. First, we'll provide an overview of the OMB data collection process. You'll become familiar with the various sections of the data collection form, including some specific categories of data and special instructions for a few of the data fields. And finally, we'll share where you can go to get more information if you have further questions. Before we start looking at the data collection form, let's talk for a minute about why it's so important to collect accurate data about project activities. The data that you report on the OMB form serves several important purposes. First, this information helps you manage your project and determine whether you're meeting your goals. Are you reaching the intended target audiences? Are underserved populations accessing your programs? And if the numbers don't reflect where you were hoping to be, where do you need to make adjustments? Without good data, you can't make good decisions about your programs. Second, the goal is for these grants to be able to sustain the successful elements of their projects after the grant period has ended. And having good data on what you've accomplished is really important in being able to demonstrate to potential funders why they should support your work. The data on the OMB form is only one part of that picture, but it's an important part. And third, the information collected on this form is also important in helping ACL demonstrate the impact of these projects and sustain funding for the future of the program. These numbers are regularly reported to Congress and ACL leadership. So now let's start getting familiar with the specifics of the form. We'll start with an overview of the OMB data collection process and requirements. The data that we're discussing today is reported twice a year as part of your semi-annual reporting process. Your report includes both a narrative report and the OMB data form. When you're submitting your data, please use the Excel spreadsheet that ACL has provided to you. There are 3 separate worksheets, which we will take a look at in more detail in a moment. When you submit your data, do not make any changes to the spreadsheet. That includes adding or removing rows, columns, or formulas. We also ask that you submit the data in Excel format. Please do not save it as a PDF file. Please note that although some of your participants may leave certain questions blank, all data fields are required, so you must attempt to collect all of these data fields for all of your direct service participants. The data that you report should always be cumulative, starting from the first date of your grant. So this means that the numbers that you report for people served, professionals trained, and direct service units should always stay the same or increase over time. We should never see them decrease. And finally, we ask that all grants check their data carefully before submitting it as a note, along with the semi-annual narrative report to Grant Solutions. We often find errors during our quality checks, and those can take a lot of time for everyone to correct. So we'll take a look in a few minutes at more details on how you can check your data. So let's take a look at the 3 worksheets of data that you'll be reporting. The first is where you will report data on people living with dementia and caregivers to whom you're providing services. We collect demographic data on various categories such as age, race and ethnicity, gender, geographic location, military status, living situation, and caregiver relationship. The second worksheet is where you'll report the number of professionals that you train on dementia, and this is broken down by the role of the person being trained. Finally, the last worksheet is where you'll report the units of direct service you provide, as well as some basic information on the categories of your expenditures. So now we'll spend a little time talking about the first worksheet, which is where you report data on people living with dementia and their caregivers. There are some important points to be aware of. First, you only need to collect data for those people who you provide direct services to. There are lots of types of project activities that don't count as direct service. These can include things like outreach events, health fairs, presentations to local community organizations with a purpose of raising awareness of the project and its services, or basic cognitive screening activities that don't include other associated support services. Also, you should not collect demographic data for both the person with dementia and their caregiver unless both people are actively participating in services. And finally, if there are people who are receiving services that are not funded by the grant, whether that's through federal or matched dollars, you would not report on those individuals either. So as I mentioned earlier, all data categories are required. If a participant opts not to provide a particular piece of information, that's okay, but all fields should be on your data collection forms. When participants leave a particular question blank, that gets recorded as missing data for that question. Similarly, participants should be the ones selecting the appropriate options within each category. They can answer these questions in writing by filling out a form, or verbally if you're asking the questions of them either in person or over the phone. The one exception to this, which we'll look at more closely, is minority status, which needs to be assigned by project staff. When you're reporting on people served and professionals trained, numbers should be unduplicated. So this means that if someone attends both a support group and a workshop, or if a professional attends multiple trainings through the grant, they're only counted once. At several points in this presentation, I'll be referencing a document that the Resource Center has developed, which includes definitions of data terms and provides answers to many frequently asked questions. ACL shared this document with you, and you can also locate it on the NADRC website or through your TA staff person. We encourage you to refer to this document frequently and to bring any questions to your TA staff member. So I want to draw your attention now to a couple of data categories that have special rules. The first category is race. And for race data, the federal government requires that program participants should have the option to select more than one category if applicable. So for example, if someone identifies as both Black or African American and white, they may select both of these options. Because people can select more than one choice, the numbers within this category may add up to a larger number than the total number of unique individuals served that's reflected in your total served row at the top of the worksheet. So you can see in this example that although the total number of caregivers in the total served row is 32, the total within the race category actually adds up to 35 based on 10 who are Black or African American, 20 who are white, and 5 where race is missing. So this is the only category where it is okay if the totals do not match. The next category that requires special procedures is minority status. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the one category that project staff must assign. This is a determination that needs to be made for each individual participant. There's no way to accurately determine the minority status numbers just by looking at the aggregate numbers that you've collected. So that means that you need to include a step in your data collection process where this field is completed by someone on your project team prior to or as the individual's data is entered in your system. This table, which is also included in the definitions and FAQs document, should provide a helpful reference to you in assigning participants to the correct category. ACL considers any individual who indicates that their ethnicity is Hispanic or Latino, or who selects any race category other than white to be minority. Only people who report the race of white only and not Hispanic or Latino are reported as not minority. And you may not have sufficient information to make this determination, in which case you can mark minority status as missing. There are a couple examples of that in this table as well. So I encourage you, if needed, to refer to this table as you begin assigning the minority status to participants who have already completed their demographic data. Okay, so moving on from these special data collection rules, let's look for a minute at how you can check the accuracy of your data before you submit it to ACL. So the totals column that you see here to the right includes formulas within the spreadsheet that are automatically going to add the number of persons with dementia and caregivers within each row. So you do not need to enter data in that totals column. So the example that you can see circled here under geographic location shows that there were 7 people living with dementia who are in an urban area, 9 caregivers, which adds up to 16. You will not need to fill in that number 16. It will automatically be summed based on the other numbers that you have entered. However, you will need to carefully check the columns of data within each demographic category to make sure that those totals within each section are matching the number in your totals row. So here's an example here where there were 10 people with dementia served and 15 caregivers served. And if you look at each category below, you'll see that the numbers within each category add up to that same total. Again, the only case where those numbers might not match is if you had 1 or more participants that have selected multiple race categories. But all of your other categories should add up exactly to the same number in that totals row. And if we receive your data and see that those numbers do not match, we will contact you and ask you to correct it. So it makes sense to spend some time on double checking those numbers before you submit them. So we've now finished looking at the first worksheet where you submit data on people with dementia and caregivers. Now we're moving on to the second worksheet within the spreadsheet, which is where you'll report data on professional training. There are many different types of professionals and service providers who you might be training as part of your project. Similar to the person served, your training attendees should select the category that most closely fits with their role or function. And there are some job titles such as a nurse or social worker that could potentially fit into multiple categories within this list. So what we ask is that the people who are being trained select the role that most closely fits with the role for which they are being trained through this project. Again, as mentioned earlier, trainees should be reported only once, even if they attend multiple trainings. So the volume of trainings that you deliver are going to be reflected in your direct service units, which we will get to shortly. But this worksheet of professional training numbers should reflect the number of people who are trained, not the number of trainings. We also talked briefly before about what counts as direct service. I just want to note here that there are certain types of presentations that would be better categorized as outreach or awareness rather than training. So in general, a training should include learning objectives or specific knowledge or skills that are being gained through this training and that are measured in your evaluation plan. And again, there's more information on these definitions of what counts as training in the definitions and FAQs document. Okay, so that was the second worksheet on professionals trained. Now we will move on to the third and final worksheet within the OMB data collection form. And this is the worksheet where you'll record information about direct service units and expenditures. This is what the entire worksheet looks like, but we will break this down to look at each of these categories separately, starting with direct service units. So you will report units of service separately for your professional training activities and for services provided to people with dementia and caregivers. And in general, every 1 hour of service that you deliver counts as 1 unit of direct service. Each person who is served counts separately, even if they're participating in a group activity, such as a support group or a workshop. So for example, if you deliver a 2-hour training class to 20 people, you would multiply the 2 hours by 20 attendees and report 40 units of direct service. In some cases, there may also be durable goods purchased by your grant that can count towards your direct services. And if that's the case, 1 unit of direct service is equal to $23 worth of goods. The second part of the services and expenditures worksheet is where you'll report on program expenditures. There are 3 categories of grant expenditures: direct services, administrative, and other programmatic expenses. Direct service expenditures are expenditures related to the services that you're providing to people with dementia, their caregivers, or through trainings. So expenses related to care consultation, to training programs, to adult day services, to memory cafes. Those are just a few examples of the types of services you might be delivering. Administrative expenses are expenses related to preparation of reports, developing contracts, accounting, so time spent on accounting, such as dispersal of funds. And then finally, the other programmatic expenses are those expenses related to program activities that do not count as direct service. So things like evaluating your project, time spent in planning meetings, in developing curriculum, in doing outreach and recruitment for participants. Those things would all count as part of other programmatic expenses. One important thing to note is that these calculations are always based on total grant funds spent to date. And this includes both the federal and match funds that you are spending. And what that means is that the 3 percentages must always add up to 100%. So in this example here at the top, we see that there's been 55% spent on direct services, 5% on administrative expenses, and 40% on other programmatic expenses. And when you add all of those up, that totals to 100%. More information on these categories and how to calculate expenditures is available in the definitions and FAQs document. So we'll just wrap up here with a few general reminders about your OMB data. First, when submitting your data, please use the exact form that has been provided. Do not modify it by adding or removing rows, columns, or formulas, and please send the form as an Excel file. Every time you submit the data, you should be reporting cumulative numbers. That is numbers from the start of your grant up through the end date of the reporting period. And finally, to save everyone time, please check and double check your numbers before submitting your data to ACL. That's really helpful to us. We do an internal review of all data before it is submitted to ACL, and we will ask you to correct your numbers if they do not add up correctly. Thank you so much for your attention today. The data that you submit will be very important both to your team and to ACL, so following the appropriate steps will be helpful to everyone. And if you have any questions at all after watching this training, there are several resources for you. As mentioned many times, the definitions and FAQs document contains much more information and is available through the NADRC website, as well as through your Resource Center staff person. You can also direct questions to me, Stephanie Hughes, at the email shown here, and you can always contact your TA support staff person who's available to help you with any questions that you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.